Welcome to the video for dividing fractions. I'm going to start by dividing 6 by 3 halves. And I'm going to use the idea that when we think of division, for instance, if I'm dividing 6 by 2, I can take 6 cookies and divide them into piles of 2. That tells me that 3 people can get 2 cookies if there's 6 cookies there. I'm going to look at that in terms of pizzas. So if there are 6 pizzas, how many people can get 3 halves of a pizza? I'm going to take 6 pizzas now and see how many people can get 3 halves of a pizza. To do that, I'm going to have to break all of my pizzas, or cut all of my pizzas in half. So I will do that. So now instead of having 6 pizzas, I have 12 things that I'm now going to divide up. So I started with 6, and now I have 6 times 2 things. So I've taken 6 and I've made 12 out of it. And now I want to see how many 3.5s. How many people can get 3.5 pizzas? That is how I'm going to answer the question. What is 6 divided by 3.5? So I notice I can get 3.5 here, 3.5 here, 3.5 here, and 3.5 here. So I can see once I take my 12 halves of a pizza, the 6 times 2, and then now I've divided it by 3, I can see that 4 people can get 3 halves of a pizza. So 6 divided by 3 halves equals 6 times 2 thirds, which equals 4. Pretty straightforward when we're looking at a whole number divided by a fraction. I'm going to try to take that same idea now and see if we can apply it to a fraction divided by a fraction. A little more abstract maybe, but I think we can do it. So I'm going to take 1/3 and I'm going to divide it by 1/2. So I'm really trying to answer the question, how many people can get half of a pizza, or how many halves are there in 1/3? And really, there's not even a whole half in 1/3. When I was looking at 3 halves in 6, there was more than one. When I say how many halves are in 1/3, it's less than 1. The question is, how much less than 1? So my answer is going to end up being a fraction. And if I look at that, I have to look at this in terms of sixths, because the difference between 1/3 and 1/2 is a sixth. So this piece up here is a sixth, and I have 2/6. So if I look at how many halves I have, I can see that I have 2/3 of a half, or I have 2/6 out of the 3/6. And if I think about my equivalent fractions, I can multiply the numerator and the denominator times 6. I get 2/3. So if I look at 1/3 divided by 1/2, I know the answer is 2/3, which is 1/3 times 2/1. So I can see that multiplying by the reciprocal does give me the right answer when I try to divide. So if I have a half now, if I think about a half now divided by 1/3, how many thirds are in a half? Well, I'm now going to have at least 1/3. The question is, how much more do I have left over? And we've got the same idea. I have to break this up into thirds to answer the question. And unfortunately, I had it broken up into 12ths. Now I've got it broken up into thirds, or actually sixths. To get a third, I need 2/6. So I know I have at least 1/3. My answer is actually going to be in terms of thirds. The question is, how many thirds do I have? I have at least 1. And then my other sixth is 1/2 of a third. So if I look at my pizza, I have 1.5 thirds, or 3/2 of a third, which is 1/2 times 3. So again, I can multiply by my reciprocal if I think of 3 as 3/1. So the question, how many thirds are in 1/2? What is 1/2 divided by 1/3? There are 1 1/2 thirds in 1/2. If I look at that in terms of 2/3 now, divided by a half, how many halves are in 2/3? Once again, I have my 2/3. I need to break it up into sixths, and I can see that I have a half. Of a pizza. So I have 1/2. And then if I think of, I have another sixth, but if I think of that in terms of thirds, a sixth is half of a third. So or a third of a half, actually. So if I look at my sixth, I'm asking the question, how many halves? I have 1/2, and then 1/3 of a half. So this would be a half. I have 1/3 of that. So I have 1/2 and a third of a half. If I look at it in terms of my reciprocal, 2/3 times 2/1 gives me 4 thirds, which is equivalent to 1 1/3. So when I answer the question, how many halves are there in 2/3, I take my 2/3 times the reciprocal of 1 half. And so we can see that what happens with a fraction that does not have 1 in the numerator, I'm going to take a half a pizza and divide it by 2/3. So how many 2/3 are there in half a pizza? And if I look at that question, I have a half a pizza. I want to see how many 2/3 I have. That wasn't a very good 2/3. So 2/3 is going to be right about here. That would be 2/3. A half is less than 2/3. So my answer is actually going to be a fraction. It's going to be less than 1. And actually I can see that I'm kind of missing a sixth. So I want to separate my half into sixths. And I can see that I need 4/6 to get 2/3. With my half, I have 3 out of those 4/6. So I have 3 out of the 4/6 that I need. So 3 out of 4. And if I look at my fraction, if I take my half and multiply it by 3/2, I get my 3/4. So if I have a half and I divide that by 2/3, I find that I only have 3/4 of the 2/3 that I need.